As we think about pollution, obviously anthropogenic pollution can have significant impacts on natural ecosystems. And this affects organisms in many different ways. It affects all types of organisms, in that living organisms have evolved with the ability to tolerate a certain range of conditions, a range of temperature, a range of pH, a range of nutrients, and so forth. And so some of the types of pollution that we are going to be discussing alter those conditions. And if conditions are outside of the evolved, adapted range of an organism, then there are going to be some negative effects. And those negative effects can vary. It's not just a sort of black and white, either the organism survives or it dies. But there is sort of a continuum in that as conditions move outside a normal range that species can tolerate, it begins to take its toll physiologically on the functioning of that organism. And that stress can lead to decreased growth, reduced reproduction, and at the extremes, death. But typically what we see is a continuum of effects on an organism. When species living in a stream, as the stream becomes more acidic and outside of the range for that species, at first there will be signs of physiological stress. If conditions continue to worsen, then growth of the organism will be reduced, reproduction will then be reduced, and eventually if conditions become too outside of tolerable conditions, that can then result in death. And this applies to all sorts of organisms, plants, animals, bacteria, all sorts of organisms require certain conditions, and pollution can alter those conditions. An excellent example of this is on coral reefs. As we talked about at the very beginning of the year, coral reefs are one of the most diverse biomes that you could find on Earth. They are home to a wide range of different types of organisms. Huge biodiversity is found in the ocean's coral reefs. And coral reefs are actually sort of a combination of coral, which is an invertebrate animal, and an algae that lives in association with the coral. They have a symbiotic relationship. And when conditions in the oceans change, that can affect both the algae in the relationship, but also in the invertebrate in the relationship, the cnidarian. They depend on each other to survive. The algae serves as the food for the coral, and it's what gives the coral its color as well. However, we are changing the Earth's oceans. Through climate change, oceans are warming. Through climate change, oceans are becoming more acidic. As we increase carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, some of that carbon dioxide dissolves in the oceans. The oceans are a huge sink of carbon dioxide, so they're becoming more acidic. Pollution from sediment or destructive fishing practice like bottom trolling can physically damage the coral. And what this can lead to is this phenomenon called coral bleaching, when either acidification or temperature impairs the functioning of the coral. And as temperature increases or as stress from pollution increases, then those algae eventually can leave the coral, abandoning that symbiotic relationship or dying off, and that leads to what we call coral bleaching. And you see here in this image coral that's been bleached, which basically means the algae portion of the symbiotic relationship is gone, and this coral now will be more susceptible to disease. It'll slowly die. It doesn't have its food source, and this is happening in a wide scale across various coral reefs. Another sort of very clear example of human impacts on natural ecosystems are through oil spills. So we talked about petroleum in our energy unit, and we know that petroleum is found and drilled from certain locations of the earth, whether that's in South America or in Russia or in the Middle East or in Texas. But this petroleum is often moved from place to place in tankers, in enormous ships, which can carry millions of gallons of petroleum from one part of the world to another part. And sometimes these tankers have accidents. Sometimes oil wells that are out in the ocean have mechanical failures. And these accidents can lead to petroleum being released into the oceans, into the environment. This is a major problem in that wildlife can be significantly affected by this, and oil being less dense than water floats on the surface. It coats, for example, the feathers of sea and shorebirds, the fur of mammals, and ingested oil can become toxic to the organisms. Some parts of the petroleum sink to the bottom of the ocean and start to affect food webs, starting with those bottom-dwelling organisms. And there are huge also economic costs that come along with the cleanup of these spills because they need to be cleaned up. There are some very famous examples of big oil spills. One of the largest that we saw in the Switch videos that we watched, they were on an offshore oil rig, and they talked briefly about the Deepwater Horizon accident. The Deepwater Horizon accident was when a offshore drilling platform had some mechanical failure at the well at the bottom of the ocean, and it leaked over 200 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Another famous one, the Exxon Valdez, was a tanker that crashed in Alaska, spilling petroleum into the ocean, and which eventually those petroleum spills in the ocean wash up on shore and affect shore animals and plants as well. There's also natural seepage of oil from natural sources. There's spilling of petroleum from various sources. There's a lot of ways that petroleum gets into the ecosystem. Sort of the flashiest, the most extreme situations are these huge accidents, which have major impacts on the environment. So to clean up these oil spills is really, really difficult. Very labor intensive. Sometimes animals that have been exposed and have petroleum and crude oil coating their feathers are just manually hand cleaned by scientists, basically using detergents, just using soap to wash off this material from their feathers and from their wings and so forth. Because the oil is less dense than the water, it floats on the surface. So there's a few things that can be done to try to remove it from the surface. So these booms can be placed around the oil spill, which basically contain it. So they float to the surface. They prevent the layer of oil at the surface from spreading further. So if you could surround the spill with these booms, you can try to contain it to a manageable surface area. And the oil can be vacuumed off of the surface. It can be skimmed off of the surface. It can be sometimes even burned off of the surface because it floats on top, or using special chemicals to disperse the oil so it's less concentrated. There are also certain types of bacteria and genetically engineered bacteria that actually can consume and break down the oil. And so that's a modern form of cleanup that's being investigated, is using these genetically engineered bacteria to consume the oil after the spill. Another type of pollution, aquatic pollution, is oxygen demanding waste. So this is typically things like nutrients or sewage. These are materials that actually increase the growth of microbes and algae, which eventually, as those organisms grow and decompose, they eventually consume so much oxygen that they create areas of low oxygen. We try to quantify this with a measurement we call biochemical oxygen demand, BOD. And a high BOD means that there's a high demand for oxygen in this ecosystem. Oxygen levels, free oxygen dissolved in the water, is going to drop, and that leads to organisms dying off. Organisms can't tolerate these low oxygen hypoxia conditions and are stressed or eventually die off. This can create dead zones, for example. You see some of that in these images. Here you have this dead zone along in the Gulf of Mexico. Because the Mississippi River travels the sort of length of the continent from north to south, along the way there is a lot of agriculture in those areas. There's a lot of organic pollution, which leads to, as that water flows through the Mississippi and eventually empties into the Gulf of Mexico, those nutrients create very high levels of biochemical oxygen demand. That there are these microbes decomposing, you have the growth of algae and algae blooms, and then the decomposition of that requires oxygen. And so you can see in these red areas you have very low concentrations of oxygen right along that coastline after the Gulf of after the Mississippi River spills into the Gulf, and those create areas in which organisms can really be stressed or even cannot survive. We often quantify this and try to show this using this oxygen SAD curve. This is an important curve to understand. And so we can look at, if we look at this first curve up in the top right, the oxygen SAD curve shows two things. It shows the level of dissolved oxygen, and it also shows the biochemical oxygen demand. So if we look at this graph, if this is a point of some sort of pollution, some sort of organic pollution, before the point of discharge of this pollution, the amount of oxygen dissolved in the water and the demand for that oxygen, the blue line, are relatively in balance. However, where this discharge happens, okay, there is a high level of demand on oxygen, higher than the amount of oxygen that has been dissolved. And that gap leads to a reduction in the amount of dissolved oxygen. So you see this dip in oxygen. That's the oxygen sag, because you have this demand which is higher than the amount of oxygen. And that leads to these hypoxic, low oxygen conditions in this area where you can have a die-off, where you can have a dead zone. And then eventually, as you get farther from that source of discharge, that pollution, the demand for oxygen reduces because you're farther away from that pollution. However, then the dissolved oxygen level can recover back up to sort of the original concentration. So when we look at a graph of these, what we see is, again, this is just shown in a little bit different way, but it's the same basic idea. We have in the clean zone before the pollution, we have high levels of dissolved oxygen and a much lower level of BOD. Right? We have a variety of species there. There's plenty of dissolved oxygen. But then we have here, that's the clean zone. Then we have some point source of pollution in this case. Right? Maybe it's raw sewage being discharged into this river. That raw sewage contains lots of organic matter, lots of nutrients. So that leads to the growth of algae and bacteria. That leads to an increase, a jump in the biological oxygen demand. Right? All of these growing bacteria and microbes require a lot of oxygen. And therefore, the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water starts to drop down. This is the oxygen sag. And it drops down in this zone, forming, and what happens if we look at sort of the biodiversity, that in the clean zone, where we had plenty of dissolved oxygen, we have a variety of different species that can survive. As we have this oxygen sag, okay, as oxygen levels decrease very low, we have just a few organisms, a few species that can tolerate these low oxygen conditions. Okay, eventually it can become so that no fish can survive in the septic zone, this zone of very low oxygen. Eventually, as we get farther away from this source of pollution, okay, we get to the recovery zone where the oxygen demand starts to tail off. The amount of dissolved oxygen starts to increase again, and then these species that were not able to tolerate those conditions can start to come back up, and then we're back into the clean zone. Now this shows what happens when you have this point source of pollution. Now imagine though, however, you have wide-scale non-point agricultural waste. If you have a stream in an agricultural area where you have a lot of runoff, where you have a lot of fertilizer use, what you're going to find is that a large portion of that area might be in this decomposition or septic or recovery zone because you have a large amount of this organic pollution coming into the ecosystem. Another form of pollution that's very important is heavy metal pollution. Heavy metals include things like lead and arsenic and mercury and cadmium and copper, a variety of different metals. But what they have in common is that they're all toxic. In certain concentrations, these metals affect various functions of animals and plants as well. And you can see some of those effects in this graph of what the various types of heavy metals, what body systems or organs they affect. And so these heavy metals come about. There are some natural sources of them. Often we see them in elevated levels because of pollution, because of industry, incineration of waste, or a burning of fossil fuels that are high in some of these heavy metals. That's where a lot of these heavy metal pollutions can come from. And one example is lead. We talked a little bit about lead in terms of air pollution, but lead is also very important when we're talking about aquatic pollution, terrestrial pollution. Lead often can be an issue in drinking water supplies. In older water systems, the solder and pipes were sometimes made with lead or connected using lead-containing compounds, and so there's some lead in the pipes that supply water, drinking water, to people. And if that lead comes into solution, is present in the drinking water, then it can lead to dangerous conditions for people that are drinking that water. There are certain additives that can be added to drinking water through water treatment that can reduce the chances of that. Old pipes can be replaced with more modern pipes to reduce this, but in older buildings and cities and with older water systems, this can be a major problem. As we talked about in our last unit, exposure to lead, especially in childhood, can lead to damage to the central nervous system, developmental delays, attention difficulties in children. And often what we see is this lead poisoning affects people from low-income backgrounds who live in older housing that hasn't been updated or modernized. And so this can be an important issue to be aware of. One example I'm sure you're probably familiar with, and we'll read more and watch more about, was what happened in Flint, Michigan, between 2014 2019. In Flint, the source of drinking water was changed, and due to some factors related to that, lead ended up leaching into the water supply, exposing thousands of children and other people to very high levels of lead. And so we'll look at this as a case study. But that lead exposure was very, very damaging. And we can see in the map of the United States here where lead water pipes are, and we can see, the Northeast is an area in the upper Midwest in which this is a major issue. Again, these are lots of times older cities, older areas with older plumbing and so forth, where this is a problem. Another type of heavy metal poisoning or heavy metal toxicity is arsenic. Arsenic can cause cancer and other severe health effects, affects the brain and kidneys. Arsenic is released through the process of mining sometimes. Also in manufacturing and industry, sometimes arsenic is a byproduct of certain manufacturing activities. And if that waste material is not disposed of properly or kept on site or taken care of, if it's instead released into the environment, then it can obviously move through the ecosystem, have serious consequences. Mercury also, especially through the burning of coal, can be released. 2/3 of it is from the burning of fossil fuels, and mercury, another heavy metal, can be damaging to the central nervous system. It's also important in that in aquatic ecosystems, mercury and other heavy metals as well can build up due to bioaccumulation. We'll talk more about that in a future topic, but as organisms consume other organisms in the food chain, these heavy metals and other toxins can build up in their body tissue. And so, we see that there's a variety of sources of these heavy metals, whether it's agriculture or mining or fossil fuel burning. And when those heavy metals and other types of pollutants are released on land, typically they eventually do end up in the water, where they can then make their way into the food web and so forth. So you'll see things about heavy metals, because heavy metal pollution in the oceans is certainly having significant effects. Some things that you might see in areas where you have stormwater sewers, often you might see a symbol on them that say not to dump anything down them, not to dump waste from your house or oil down those stormwater sewers, because they're not treated. That stormwater often just goes directly into bodies of water. In our area, maybe it goes directly into the Mohawk River, because really what it's supposed to be capturing is just stormwater, just rainwater, rather than running off on roads. It'll go into catch basins, and that's all funneled into a body of water somewhere. If people are dumping things into that, into those stormwater systems, it can end up in our bodies of water. There are sometimes warnings about how much fish a person should eat, depending on where that fish came from and where it lies on the food chain. As we talk about bioaccumulation, we'll talk about why these heavy metals tend to be more concentrated the higher up the food chain that you go. Litter is an important pollutant as well, especially plastic pollution. We, as a society, use huge amounts of plastics, and often these are single-use plastics which are disposed of, and often these plastics end up in the ocean, where they can have serious effects on wildlife, on the ecosystem. Animals, marine animals, can consume these plastics by accident. They can create intestinal blockages. You see in this whale the amount of plastic that it's consumed, and people dissect aquatic animals and find plastic in organisms, even organisms that live deep in the water or way in remote areas, that these plastics makes their way through ocean currents all over the world. As they decompose, some of them produce toxic substances that leach into the water. There are also things we don't even realize, these microplastics, tiny little plastic beads that are sometimes used in like shampoos or soaps or conditioners or toothpaste. And they're tiny little plastic beads that we don't know are there, but they, as we use these products, they wash down the drain, and they eventually do end up in aquatic ecosystems. And there are because of ocean currents, certain areas where you have concentrations of this plastic pollution washes up in certain areas. And plastic lasts a long time. A plastic bag that you might get from, or used to get from the grocery store, takes about 20 years to decompose in the oceans. You can see some things like fishing line or plastic bottles, diapers, they take hundreds of years to decompose. And if you think about how many of these items we are contributing to the environment, it's a huge amount. And this is where proper disposal of these plastics is really important, where recycling is really important, where most importantly, the reduction in the use of these plastics is the best thing that we can do to try to improve upon this problem. And if we can reduce the amount of plastics we use, obviously that's going to lead to less impact on the environment. And so, when you use reusable bags at the grocery store, when you refill a water bottle, when you use a reusable mug for coffee rather than getting a disposable, and all of these things are ways that we individually can try to reduce our impact. Sediment is another type of pollutant, and we talked about runoff in agriculture or deforestation settings. As just sediment enters aquatic ecosystems, it has several effects. First off, these areas of sediment mean less light getting into the water for the producers. Sediment can clog the gills of fish and other aquatic animals, can disrupt habitats as it settles to the bottom of these bodies of water. The sediment comes from lots of different things. Come from construction along the shoreline, can come from agricultural runoff, fields that have been plowed and then exposed to rain. We know from previous units that runoff can erode the soil, bringing it into rivers and streams and so forth. Deforestation can increase the amount of sediment that makes its way into streams and rivers in the ocean. It's about 70% of this sediment that's running off is due to human activity that's anthropogenic. So how do governments attempt to deal with some of these issues related to terrestrial and aquatic pollution? Well, we have several laws in the United States that have been passed to help with this. And so some that you should be familiar with are the CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. It's passed in 1980. It's administered by the Environmental Protection Agency. It's also called the Superfund Law. You may have heard of this, a Superfund site. What a Superfund site is, it is an area that has been contaminated by some hazardous substance that's been identified and has been targeted for cleanup. And so there are about 40,000 of these federal Superfund sites. And what the law attempts to do is to figure out who is or was responsible for the pollution, and then through legal means compel them to pay for the cleanup process. It's called the polluter pays principle. And in this legislation, 70% of the cost for the cleanup is paid by the responsible party, the business or the individual that's responsible for the original pollution. And so after a site has been assessed and is added to the list, it's then cleanup strategies are designed, ways of neutralizing the substances that are cause the pollution, or removing them from the site, and eventually replacing or rehabilitating these areas so that they can be usable in some way again. A famous example of this sort of type of toxic pollution is the Love Canal disaster. We'll read more about this as a case study as well. Love Canal is out near Buffalo in Niagara Falls, and it was a neighborhood that had industry in it, where there was decade after decade of toxic materials being dumped, and it led to extremely hazardous conditions. And this was at the beginning of the passage of this CERCLA law, which was trying to address issues such as this, and it took a period of 20 years to clean up this Love Canal neighborhood. You may be familiar with Onondaga Lake in Syracuse, right near the Destiny in Syracuse, that huge lake you drive by on the thruway. Extremely polluted at one time. It was a Superfund site, and it is now nearing sort of the end of the cleanup stages of taking Onondaga Lake from a lake where you couldn't go in the water, you couldn't fish there, you couldn't eat anything that came out of those waters, you couldn't swim, to a lake ecosystem has been rehabilitated where it's much safer, much more healthy, and those it's because of this legislation. Another type of legislation is the Clean Water Act of 1972, which is responsible for surface waters, streams and lakes and oceans. And the Clean Water Act is set standards and regulations on pollution, monitors conditions in the nation's waters to maintain their health. The Clean Water Act funds the treatment of wastewater and maintaining wetlands, which can help to filter out toxins and nutrients from the waters. The Clean Water Act doesn't monitor or regulate groundwater or drinking water. We'll talk in the next slide about that. It also requires permits. So if a industry, a company is going to be releasing pollution into bodies of water, they have to gain permits. There has to be monitoring of what that wastewater contains, so that it can be regulated. And so you could see where Clean Water Act, the sort of steps of having standards for the water quality, monitoring, assessing, and then helping to control and manage these sources of And then the last law we'll talk about is the Safe Drinking Water Act. Now, the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed in 1974. This is responsible for monitoring and making sure drinking water in the United States is safe, public water systems. Most of us probably get our water from a public water system. Okay, you have water lines supplying your house with water, comes from a centralized area where that water has been treated. Now, some people, if you live out in the country a little ways, you may not be connected to our public water system. You may actually have a well, basically a pipe drilled into the ground that provides water for you to drink. There's over 150,000 public water systems throughout the country, and it's the Safe Drinking Water Act that helps with the regulation of that. And it regulates things such as bacteria in the water, disinfectants and their byproducts, organic chemicals, heavy metals, radioactive chemicals. It monitors all of those things and allows for the public to be confident, hopefully, that their drinking water is safe. You can go online, and you're going to do this, and look at a report, because the Safe Drinking Water Act requires testing and reporting of the water quality. And so to ensure there is safe drinking water, there is several different things that can be done. Okay, so one of those, and you see this in this bottom diagram, protecting the source. So our water comes from some natural source. Okay, and for us, it's the Hinckley Reservoir up north of where we live. That's the source of our drinking water. So if there was some contaminant in that area, obviously that would have an effect on our drinking water. And so protecting these sources and being sure of surrounding activities to prevent the pollution of the source is really important. But that water, as it makes its way to us, also goes through a water treatment plant, which then maybe adds chlorine to the water to kill any potential bacteria. Fluoride is added to the water to help prevent cavities. It's various procedures are done to eliminate any potential contaminants, and the water is monitored. And then eventually it's distributed to our houses through pipes. Again, those pipes can be a source of pollution, can be a source of lead and so forth. So we have to monitor that as well until eventually that drinking water gets to us. So there's several steps in which drinking water is protected, and that's due to the Safe Drinking Water Act from 1974.